There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released, so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stonings. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, prosecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves, in holes in the ground. These were all commended of their faith. Yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Hebrews 11:35-40. When Christ calls a man, he bids him to come and die. Hi, Sam here, and tonight we're starting a discussion of Introduction to Christianity.
Nope. Wrong book.
Oh, whoa! You're totally correct. Sorry, we're just starting a discussion of The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So we had it right on the stream. So if you're, wow, I know. Well, like I said before, well, apparently no one's watching to be embarrassed by this, but
we'll cut it in post.
Yeah, perhaps I will. So. Actually, I don't think I'm doing cutting because that is one of the advantages of live streaming is that it's right there.
Isn't that TLC? There's no cutting. There's no editing. There's no quality.
Well, to be fair, look, if it's an hour, I could give someone a break. But like when certain people put up like 4-hour live streams and they don't tag anything, and I'm just like, where are they discussing this? Yeah, but.
It's like, oh yeah, you got to watch this banger.
Yeah. So yeah, but enough of TLC inside baseball here. Why don't we go through here? We're Zeke's the new member here, and if anyone's watching this and they haven't seen him around before, he's been very active in the Discord, but as far as I know, hasn't been on any live streams really before now. So I guess this is his live stream premiere maybe. And so ladies, if you're single, he's been looking. It's funny. I was teasing him about that when we were on Discord this past weekend, and then someone else actually came on and said something very similar about him, like, "Oh, you should get on YouTube." But yeah, I do know of one TLC couple, but I don't know if in general that's a good strategy. So okay, so who knows? Maybe it'll be another. But anyways, I'll let. How about you go first, Zeke? Just kind of introduce yourself. Tell us anything you want us to know about you, and maybe a little bit about what you're hoping to get out of Cost of Discipleship here.
Sure. Yeah. I'm Zeke. I live in South Carolina. When Sam first asked me to do this, I pretty much instantly said yes. I remember I read Bonhoeffer back when I was in, I want to say 7th grade, because I had a friend who had the Bonhoeffer Metaxas book. And so I said, I want that. And it was my birthday, my parents take me to a Christian bookstore and they say, pick out whatever you want. And that's what you're getting. And so I said, I just want the big one. And I read it in a summertime and I thought it was awesome. And then I didn't really think about Bonhoeffer until that movie came out recently, Angel Studios. And I said, interesting. I guess I'll have to get back into it. And then I know me and Mark had saw some articles back and forth about Bonhoeffer, kind of saying is this really accurate or stuff like that. So really, really interested to know more about him. I've heard a lot about him, different things. Obviously I find the time period very fascinating and I'm always up to read a good book. I've been reading a lot of slop this year, unfortunately, way too much, just junk fiction that is just, it's terrible, but it's just so fun. So hopefully I can read something a little more enlightening. I know Freerillian wants me to read some Chesterton this year, so hopefully this is on the road to that. So,
all right. Okay, so Mark, I assume people are probably a little more familiar with you than they are with Zeke, but anything you want to let us
maybe
know?
minorly, but not very much.
Well, I mean, if they're watching this, though,
if they've watched the other one, then yeah. But just refresher. I'm Mark F., one of the moderators on BOM Discord. Here in Ottawa, Canada, representing the Canucks. Yankees go home. But when I was asked to do this by Sam, I just want to do another book up with Sam. But when he mentioned this book, it occurred to me I had only heard that name recently, mostly because I'd read Ratzinger. And Ratzinger at least touches on Bonhoeffer once or twice, I think, in either an essay I read of his or in the first volume of Jesus of Nazareth. And to me, he was just another Lutheran or another German name that Ratzinger was quoting. I didn't realize how, I guess, big he was for a lot of people because I had never heard the name before. Growing up in very secular Canada, it's not exactly like I was reading it in grade 7. So to me, this is a complete going in blind with no real ideas of what's going to be in the book. So it's a blind first reading.
Okay, yeah, I mean, for myself, my name's Sam. I'm a channel, I guess, I don't know, monitor, I guess, or owner, but
owner
and yep,
proprietor,
yeah, and I guess it's a book, Cost of Discipleship, that I had read in my 20s, and it was something where I read it when I was going through some life transitions, and I remember PVK saying a few times that he read the book, and when he read it, he was like, okay, I'm going to go become a traveling evangelist now. And while I don't think that's any like specific instructions he got from the book, I mean, there is something about it that I could definitely imagine if I read it when I was like 17, of it having the effect on me that like some people say that Ayn Rand has on people, or that maybe Lord of the Rings does, where it's just one of those books that really sticks with you. And I mean, it's you talk about Ratzinger, one of the common threads through is there's this both starkness and deepness to the language that is really present there. And I'm definitely looking forward to going through it again and just having a second read and just spending some time with one of my favorite authors. So any other like introductory thoughts from either one of you? Or
well, I mean, maybe just some background of the book if you guys can give it out for me.
Okay.
I said I'm going in very blind.
Yeah. Okay. So I put together kind of a basic sort of outline of which I want to think. So one of the things that with this, as I was telling Mark before we started recording, is I kind of thought like, oh, this will be easier than the stuff we had done before because it's fairly light reading, which it was, but at the same time, there wasn't a real obvious like conversation point to start and going through the introduction and the biography that I had read today. So hopefully I did a decent job. I think I got there, but just to kind of, I guess, outline real quickly. And I want to thank, I had gotten a timeline that was put together by Brant Himes of Regent University in Vancouver. And that's in the notes if you want to link to it. But Bonhoeffer, just real quickly, born 1906 to a family. His father was a scientist, and on his mother's side of the family, I guess there had been a number of theologians and ministers. So even though it was something of a conflict between him and his parents, when he had said, I want to become a theologian, there were other ministers in the family. So in that sense, it wasn't too big of a surprise. So through 1930, he had been doing his academic training. And as I understand it, he did at least one dissertation. And I believe he started but did not finish a second one. So I don't know if it was a MDiv or a PhD, but I don't know if anyone really cares that much. And I guess for the purpose of like the book and our discussions, 1933 is really when his he became public as a dissident. He had given a radio address in October of that year where he had more or less said that Nazism was a heresy. And from that point, he was kind of on the radar for the Third Reich, but it would be a number of years still till he was publicly persecuted or jailed. So, and then 35 to 37, those were the years where he wrote, The Cost of Discipleship, which is probably his best known book. And then the other one, Life Together, is probably, I would say that's maybe his second best known book. And then 1939, that's another important year. So he had been in the U.S. before, but he had gone to the U.S. in part because he was concerned about things going on in Germany at the time. And he goes there in July of that year. He goes there in June of that year. And then he feels convicted, and he's like, man, I have to be in Germany. I want to be with my people. And in July that same year, he returns. And when he returns, he is a double agent or a spy. And it's that's part of the reason he returned. It was his brother-in-law who had, I guess, arranged some things. So he was part of, I guess, I don't know. I guess it's not really clear what exactly his position was, but basically he had been in a plot to actively deceive the Nazi party. And then September 1939, that's the beginning of the war. 1940, that's around the time that he begins another one of his well-known books, Ethics. Ethics, I remember reading that, and I guess of the three that I'll mention kind of in the outline, that's the one that was kind of the most messy, but in some ways it's also the one that's maybe the most relevant in some ways to things that had happened during the war. So April 1943, he's arrested and imprisoned, and then he's moved from a number of different prisons and eventually to the Buchenwald concentration camp, where he is executed in April 9th, 1945. So to kind of give a timeline, if you're not the most historically literate person, a few weeks later, that camp would be liberated. And even though the war did not officially end with Germany till later that year, April 30th, 1945 is the day that Hitler committed suicide. So it's sort of a recap in terms of I guess the facts of it. In terms of now, just so if anyone's hearing that and they're thinking wait, I didn't know I was tuning into a history session here. That's really just kind of the biographical sketch of Bonhoeffer that's in the introduction to in addition to costs of discipleship that we're reading. So, any thoughts with that? I know Mark is still well. I'll allow you. He's still waiting on the book, but. Did you have anything you wanted to add or anything that really stood out to you in the biographical sketch part of it, Zeke?
Yeah, so I think, I guess if we're just talking the biographical part, from like my understanding, I think what maybe kind of piqued my interest here was, I think Bonhoeffer, especially in the more modern kind of context that we have and how we discuss history, he's kind of painted as like this almost a saint figure, very like true martyr, but like in a Protestant sense. And I think reading like this, at least reading this intro and stuff like that, and the memoir section they had, he was less of the Protestant like James Bond going in and doing all this cool fun stuff, and more like a typical, like I've been reading They Flew by Carlos Erie recently, and so I really been getting into the the Catholic kind of mindset of how they view saints and everything, and it's not always fun. It's honestly kind of depressing a lot of the times. So, and because he's very tortured in a way, like he really, like when he goes to New York and his friends are like, "Hey, we're gonna get you out of there, and don't worry, we're gonna save you." And then he's like, "I gotta go back to my boys, my people back in Germany." He really wanted to go back, and he couldn't abandon them. And you can kind of see. I think I'm excited. I'm interested to see how much of that tortured mind you'll see in his writing, just because I think that's probably a big part of who he actually was versus the cool international spy that he kind of gets portrayed in the American media in his limited viewership here, because that tends to sell better, right? Like no one really wants to hear about some whiny brat, whatever, not brat, but like a whiny guy that's just like, oh, poor me. They want to see the cool, fun superhero. And not everybody is like that. I do think this is a more of a quote unquote nuanced kind of view on it. So I'm very interested to see how that kind of plays out.
Yeah. Do you think America resists saints like that?
Really? I would say so. I would think so. I mean, look at the American myths and founders of people, right? Like, I mean, yeah, George Washington chopped down the cherry tree and stuff like that, like, as a little, I guess, kind of on the same thing. But generally speaking, it's like Paul Bunyan. There's this big dude as a big axe, right? Or all these different, like all of our people that we lionize, we tend to look at them in the biggest possible light of being just like big, strong dudes. Teddy Roosevelt, I guess the closest would be like an FDR because he was kind of sickly towards the end. But even still, generally, we kind of view people in the more positive when they're like doing things that's like big, fun, and cool, as opposed to being like more of a Mother Teresa kind of figure. Now, of course, we like Mother Teresa. I mean, I think all Americans would say Mother Teresa is pretty great, but I think she's like the exception to the rule.
Yeah. Yes, I find that interesting because someone that's been on my mind for quite a while has been St. Thomas More.
Okay.
In particular because he's the patron saint of civil servants. And trying to come to grips with, well, how far can you push things and how far until you have to say, because we're talking about Lutheran, here I stand, I can do nothing else, right? That sort of thing seems to grip the imagination, I think, very strongly. I know in England it still does, right? They don't call him St. Thomas More, they just call him Thomas More. But that is kind of what I was getting at in terms of, are you sure people don't like that? I know it's not flashy, but maybe it's just people like us who tend to read books who like that very much. I don't want to say it's refined, but it definitely is something deeper.
Yeah. Well, I know one of the thoughts that I've had in my mind, and I don't think it relates at least quite directly to the reading of the book, but is the idea of brokenness. And, you think of Christ, and he's the perfect person, but at the same time, when he is resurrected, he still has the wound in his side. And I know in listening to the White Horse Inn, one of the people they talked about Christ's death and resurrection, and Corinthians, what it says is that he's the first fruits of those sown in the ground. So, I mean, it's not just that he is broken, but that he, in some ways, has to be broken. And even in his glorification, I mean, he remains broken. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't think anyone wants to be broken, right? I mean, I think we Americans probably tend to very much glorify aspirational figures, right? I mean, you talk about Teddy Roosevelt, or I don't know. I mean, well, or George Washington, or these people who I don't know, they're quote unquote the mighty men of history, and yeah, but I don't know if people necessarily want to always remember the people who, I don't know, might remind us in some ways of our failures or the failures of humanity.
It's something that we're always confronted with as the baptized, right? We're called to emulate the man who was broken on a cross. And that brokenness means he's healed it, right? What Christ has assumed, he has healed. And so having brokenness and having a wound through it all means he's healed that and taken it through to the next, what Ratzinger said, beyond bios.
Yes.
I think is a great term. Just to bring it back to Bonhoeffer, actually, when you were talking, it kind of got me thinking about, it's almost like a Peter type story, right? Where Peter is leaving Rome, and of course the myth goes that Christ appeared to him and say, why are you abandoning me? And that's kind of what that feels like when you describe Dietrich Bonhoeffer going back to Germany after having escaped, and feeling the guilt, maybe not just of leaving his country, but leaving what he feels is probably his mission. So he goes back knowing what it's going to mean.
Right. Yeah, because it was interesting because he was really a big, I mean, this is where I first heard of the ecumenical movement, and that was, obviously Protestants kind of spearheaded that, but he was really active in that, especially as far as I remember, more in the early part of the war. But as the war kind of picked up, I think a lot of the other Germans that were participating in that tended to affirm like the Nazi party and stuff like that. So he kind of felt, as from what I remember at least, that he felt that the movement kind of abandoned true Christianity. And so I know for him, when he said he would get at least according to the memoir in this book, he was in New York only for a few weeks, and he was supposed to teach like a whole semester. And because he was just so tortured, even though he was in the greatest city in the world, he still felt like, he just had to go back to Germany because, he was praying every day at the same time that people in Germany were. And he felt that he just couldn't do that effectively, even small things like that, while he was overseas.
When you bring that up, it actually feels like a great metaphor. I know neither of you go to confession, but I go to confession. I know when I need to go, it doesn't matter what's going on around me. It feels like ash. Nothing's right and needs to be set right again. And that kind of feels like the metaphor that you're talking about here. At least metaphorically, the pattern of this sort of thing is that you can't be right unless you're doing what is right.
I think of like, the sort of the comparison and contrast between Ratzinger and Bonhoeffer. And I mean, if Introduction to Christianity is a college lecture, I mean, there really is a way in which the cost of discipleship is kind of a Protestant sermon. And I mean, the thing about sermons is sometimes we hear them, and I know sometimes I hear them and I think, oh, this person doesn't really believe this sermon for X, Y, and Z reasons. But the whole point of it is that they're giving the sermon that they need to hear a lot of the time. And I mean, it's something like where, I don't know, like I don't know. Well, this is going to come off as a tangent, but like I like to think of, like, for example, wedding vows, and like, I mean, what does it mean to, love someone in sickness and in health. Like there's no like objective standard. There's no qualitative or quantitative component to that, right? But the point is that it's a goal, right? And I mean, in a sense, I mean, yeah, if you're a Christian, I mean, Christ is the goal, and that's kind of the whole point. But I mean, that also has a component of sacrifice to it that, I mean, I think we're probably not very good at if we're, to use sort of like I don't know, Jonah Goldbergism, if we're weird people, wealthy, industrialized, rich and educated. So I know I got those letters jumbled, but I think the point.
Western, industrialized, rich, educated, democratic.
Yes, yeah, democratic. Yeah.
It's not good that I know that off the top of my head.
But no, I think it gets at one of the questions I had, which is, I mean, it was what I had put on the title of the live stream, which is that, I mean, do we sometimes learn the wrong thing from Martyrs? Because, well, one of the things that I think Gavin Ortland had gotten into is, so there was a video recently from Angel Media, the Bonhoeffer film, and that came out around the end of November, near Thanksgiving. And for anyone who's not familiar, Angel Media, it's the company that is best known for producing Sound of Freedom. So it's I don't know how accurate it necessarily is, but it's coded as kind of like a right-wing media company. If you see things about it in the news, I honestly haven't watched any of their movies. I don't know if that's entirely accurate or true or not. But then at the same time, I couldn't help but thinking that there probably were a number of liberal churches where Bonhoeffer was probably quoted at some point before the election. And it's like, I don't know, these things are obviously kind of out of line in some level. And it's like, what are we missing? Are we just using this person as a tool for whatever happens to be trendy at the moment? Or is one side right and the other wrong? Or why is this happening that people seem to, at least on some level, be taking the opposite lessons from the same person?
I know I talk too much here, but I was wondering about the title, what we're going to get onto it. But when you're discussing it there, what it reminds me of is, you've probably heard maybe you haven't, a quip that the Dominicans say about the Franciscans is, you know why the Franciscans split so much? Because they're always following Francis. We follow a rule. And because they're following a man, or what they believe is a man, right? They go in different directions in their interpretations of St. Francis. So there's constantly generating new orders of Franciscans. Dominicans are rather staid and stable for the most part, because they have a set rule. But that's kind of what I think you're getting at there, is that the Bonhoeffer can be put up, just like many other saints, for whatever purpose you want. And it's kind of hard, unless you have something overarching above that, to get it into the right frame.
Yeah. So, yeah. I guess I have two thoughts as far as an answer to that goes. I think that's right. But do you have any thoughts to that question, Zeke?
I guess kind of to Mark's point, I would say like MLK is another figure in America where on the right, like on his day, everybody quotes him, but like they kind of do it in different ways. And I think, especially in this recent election, without getting political, the allusions to one side being similar to someone that Bonhoeffer may or may not have, faced off against, right? So it was very easy cannon fodder, right? And I think, whereas if you actually kind of drill down into it, I don't think it's really analogous. But yeah, it's very easy. I would definitely agree with the idea that when you lionize an individual person, it's very easy to kind of, because it's all interpretation, whereas a rule can be a lot more harder and fast. less hard and fast. And yeah, I think in terms of the question about what do we learn the wrong lessons from Martyrs, I think it's very easy to kind of think of, oh, anybody can just go and die for something. But when you actually see people do it, it's not that easy. I think of I just watched the short film, the 21, about the Coptic martyrs and the one Ghanaian I believe it was in captured by ISIS a few years ago, and really well done. It was like 20 minutes long, and just the kind of impact that it had on both their captors and the people around them, and B, it's just something that we don't really ever have to think about. So of course for us, it's very easy to say, I can do that. That's no problem. I would totally do the same thing if it came down to it. And then whenever any sort of small hardship happens, we kind of freak out and panic. If Twitter's down or Discord's down or whatever, everyone freaks out, right? So would it actually come to that? And it's also a question comes that it's a lot easier to die for something than it is to live for something, right? Because once you're dead, that's theoretically it in this temporal sense. Whereas if you actually have to live with the consequences of your actions, it is much harder. Example, say if Bonhoeffer had decided to stay in New York and he didn't come back to Germany, waited a few years to the war, he could have came back and said, hey, I'm here to, usher in the church into a new direction, right? But he would have had to live with that survivor's guilt of thinking, I could have been there, I could have changed things. And sure, God could have used him, obviously, in that kind of capacity, but it would not have been the same. And he, obviously the ripple effect, right, kind of goes down there. So it's not really something that to be taken lightly. And I think people look at it a little too glib, and they kind of think, well, I would definitely have done that. And it's a one-to-one answer when it's definitely a lot more complicated than that. And I don't think and sometimes maybe there's obviously I can't speak to every situation, but sometimes not everyone is called to be a martyr, right? Sometimes you are called to survive because you have a different call for your life, right? So vocations, Catholics know more about vocations than Protestants probably because they talk about them all the time, but they are very, very tricky. Yeah, they're very tricky. So because it's not easy. Anybody can kind of say, well, I can just go around and be a hermit, right? Or I can be this, I can be that. But are you actually called to do that? That's where it kind of gets really tricky. So
yeah, that's definitely one of the thoughts that I had in my mind is I want to be very careful here. But I do think there's a way in which living in a time of conflict is probably easier for someone who has a faith because it does give them a kind of moral clarity that you don't necessarily have in your day-to-day life. And I think one of the temptations when you're living through a time that could be considered, if you will, a time of boredom or stasis is to basically use that moral clarity as a bludgeon against people you might disagree with. And that's not to say that there's never times when, being confrontational or having maybe the mindset of someone who's a dissonant is wrong, but it's also, sometimes if you're a follower of Christ, sometimes you're Samson, right? You're tearing down the pillars, and then other times, though, you're Daniel and you're praying for the peaceless city. And I think those are both things that are, and in some ways, I think everyone would probably prefer one over the other. I think in some ways, being in a time of conflict gives you a moral clarity that you don't have when you're not in a active conflict. So that's kind of one thought that I had. And the other thought I had is I wouldn't blame people if they didn't know who Bonhoeffer was, that they might think oh, he's I don't know, like MLK or I don't know, maybe Jesse Jackson, because one of the big things that people hear about him, if they don't know that much, is political involvement part of it, which, I mean, he was involved in politics and he definitely had a viewpoint, but he also, there wasn't like a clear programmatic thing that you could garner from reading The Cost of Discipleship or Life Together or even Ethics. I mean, it's really, I mean, it's theology. It's not politics, if you will.
Well, that's usually the marker of something that's quite deep, is it's hard to place on any scale you're going to find. Learning wrong lessons from the martyrs. I think this talk about conflict is very true. You know, probably something Zeke's seen too. You know, dying's easy, young man. Living's harder. In a way, it is easier in that once your decision is made, it's clear, it's done, and you can't go back on it sometimes. Most of the time, right? You know, once you're in the camp, you're in the camp. And for some of us, I think there's an envy that we live in, basically, like you say, sometimes a boring time where your journey to sainthood is not looking at that woman's ass, right? It's like, and maintaining that for 80 years. That's a long time. Just saying. So it's those little things that you have to conquer that lead to greater sins, right? It's the venial leads to the mortal. And it's such a long marathon. It's a long time where in some ways that conflict that forces martyrdom, great heroism, yes, but it's also a sprint. And once it's done, right? As horrible as that is, and it's not to diminish the heroism, it's to remind you that there is a heroism in and of itself in doing the little things and doing them well and doing them prayerfully so that you can try to climb up that holy mountain yourself, because you're not getting an elevator.
Yeah. And it's something I think also we kind of, with the Hollywood kind of culture we live in, everything is so glamorized. Like, obviously there's been some saints with a lot of the hagiographies in their martyrdom, and it's like, oh, well, they had this nice quip at the end and they go out in a blaze of glory, right? Or they get their head cut off, whatever it was. Whereas but I'm sure a lot of the times it was actually a lot more brutal. I'm sure the deaths were very slow, and it wasn't always the cool, fun hagiography you get. You might get that written later because it sounds better, but generally speaking, a lot of those were pretty brutal. So I think when we kind of, because it's much easier for us to say, well, and in some ways that's probably pride, thinking, well, I'm going to go out on top and I'm going to kind of own the libs. You know, that's what I'm going to do.
Before he dies. Stop. It's got stop.
But, you know, you kind of have to avoid that, because that is, of course, kind of, I think, very prideful. And then also, I think in kind of the inverse of that, a lot of times, maybe sometimes you're not going to actually die as a martyr or whatever, but if in terms of talking about vocations, looking at Jonah, where he was called to do something very clearly, and then he had all kind of almost the quote unquote right things to say, well, you know, those are sinful people, they deserve to die, get them out of here, I don't want to talk to them, they don't like me anyways, bad people. And then God's like, no, you're gonna do that, you know, I don't care what you have to do, but you are going to do that. And obviously that was the right call in the end of the day. But sometimes you can make the excuses saying, well, I'm actually doing the right Christian thing by not actually following through on what, you know, God is calling me to do. And sometimes that's not always the case. So,
yeah, I was struck when in reading the foreword by Metaxas, where he had said that he had been told about Bonhoeffer by someone who is a more active Christian than he was at the time. And one of the things that he read when he looked up stuff about Bonhoeffer was the line that I'd read at the beginning, when Christ calls a man, he bids him to come and die. And I couldn't help but think about that. In some ways, it's like not a good advertisement for Christianity, but it's also, there's a way in which if someone's a martyr, they're on a different timetable then, but at the same time, I mean, we're all experiencing death in some way. And I think of that with my family. I think of that even though God willing for me, that'll be many years. I think of my body and my mind and like the way in which it's in some ways not as nimble as it was maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And yeah, I mean, living through that maybe sometimes is perhaps harder than yeah, being cut away from that. I mean, I guess, yeah, it's Paul. I mean, yeah, to live as Christ, right? But yeah, to die is gain, I think about it. So,
Well, remember, we're recording in the year of our Lord 2025 in Lent, right? Ash Wednesday
yep.
just passed. And I know when you go up, people who don't know this, when you go up to get the ashes, the priest says something to the expression of, you know, from dust you were taken and to dust you shall return, right? In the Latin, it's memento mori, meaning remember your death. And that's the start of the penitential season, is remembering that fact and that you should be preparing for it at all times because he's coming like a thief in the night. I know, I don't know about you guys, but definitely when I've had times I've fallen into some sin, whether it's one thing or the other, it's definitely crushing to me, at least, because I don't know now what's happening. I need to have my relationship set right again. I need absolution. Depending on your particular theology, but definitely from the Catholic perspective, right? You're potentially in danger. So that is a constant reminder, for me at least, that death is always around the corner. Even the going downstairs, sometimes I'm like, I should be careful. I should be really careful right now. As dumb as that sounds, it's definitely crossed my mind. I'm like, oh, no, not here.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, no, something where, yeah, I know it's something that's more conscious in my mind than it was at yeah, one point. I guess I've been afraid of the stairs, but I do know there's a couple times when I've been, well, I remember one time when I was hiking and I was actually on a section of a mountain, but wouldn't be the right term for it really, but rocky area where you basically should not have been there. Well, Mark will appreciate this. There's actually a First Nations marker that clearly was the line where you weren't supposed to go to the other side of it, and I did, and I was in a real danger, but I was kind of slipping down the side of this hill, and I remember thinking, like, why do I do these things?
Why did I do this?
Endangering my body. But yeah, but at the same time, I mean, I guess like a lot of what we, I mean, when we think of ourselves as not in danger, though, I mean, we're not necessarily really any more in control. And I mean, that's kind of the message of the cross, right? That ultimately, I mean, we give ourselves over to Christ, and He's going to do what He wills. Yeah. And I mean, I hope for myself that means a long life and prosperity, but I mean, maybe it doesn't though sometimes, and it's yeah, having yeah, to be at peace with that one way or the other can be hard.
Do you guys have a favorite saint?
I don't know. I had a couple. I would say it's really a tough question. I think because I read the most of him, Saint Augustine, probably. I also like Saint Moses the Black, Orthodox saint, but you know, still pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah. I would probably say not really. It would probably do me good to like read the lives of the saints, and yeah, I did start with Scorsese's series that was like small like biographies of the saints, which was kind of interesting. I watched John the Baptist and the Joan of Arc ones.
Okay, I think it's interesting that I know when I think kind of like Zeke, you go to like a lot of those intellectual ones, and you think to yourself, well, should I not be trying to be the ones that were look at the martyrs,
Right.
It's not to say some of those intellectual saints didn't go through a lot of trouble. I mean, Saint Jerome, a lot of trouble. Thomas Aquinas had to fight off a prostitute with a poker. Great story. But really, like, shouldn't it be Saint Lawrence sometimes that we think of as what we should be, or Saint Felicia and Perpetua, things like that, like, the great martyrs of the church. But in some way, that's just bringing back around. Instead of the mistakes we learn, it should be, on the flip side, the great aspects of that, where you're so willing to mortify yourself that you're definitely willing to die. And it's for someone who's never had the experience of seeing their life flash before their eyes. I don't recommend it. It has happened to me. But it definitely puts things in perspective very quickly of how much you rationally fear death. Right? For me, it was when I was learning to fly and I saw another person who was doing the wrong thing and they almost hit my plane. They came so close, I saw them in the cockpit, and it was someone in my class.
And he wasn't Maverick.
No Maverick. Definitely not. But that sort of experience is what I go back to when I think of my martyrdom, and how strongly I recoil from that feeling. So on the other side, we're talking about, in some ways it's easier, but tell me it's not. In a lot of ways, it's not.
No, yeah. So, and I mean, I guess the hole that it leaves, I don't know, people you care about, if you've had anyone in your family who died young. I mean, because, in some ways, well, sometimes you say they've gone on to their reward, right? When someone passes, which, it's kind of cliche language, but at the same time, if you're a Christian, you really believe that. But I don't know. I think of people in my family, and I still think of like my cousin who died, probably 12 years ago now. And he was, about 13 months older than me. And I think about it in a real sense, I'm older than he'll ever be. But at the same time, I also think of him as being older than me because that's all I ever experienced. And I think of the things that are lost, but at the same time, that's, I don't know, something that, Christ asks us to surrender.
Early death is kind of like a rending.
Yeah.
In many ways for a family. My brother-in-law died at 26. And it's very strange walking around my in-laws' house and you see pictures of him and they're frozen, right? They say stop at a certain point and they never continue. It's a very rending experience, but definitely something to keep in mind.
Maybe to pull the conversation back a little bit. Another one of the conversation questions I had was, when is it the right thing to do violence? Or maybe actually Bonhoeffer would actually say, when is it the right thing to maybe violate one of the 10 Commandments?
Just war theory.
So, well, for him, it wasn't a theoretical question, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, But, I think of that, and I think of, one of the things I thought about first was, for some context, the cost of discipleship was written in 1937, and it was 1940 when he began um, his I guess like time, or sorry, rather 1939, he began his time when he was in the underground actively. And there definitely was some doubts and things that he had before that. And I feel like it's a common story. You think of like the saints and the prophets, and it's Elijah in the wilderness, or it's maybe you think of like David at some points in the Psalms where they feel hesitant or betrayed in some way, but then they come through it. Even Christ in the temptations in the wilderness. And so I thought of that. And I guess to answer the question, maybe a little bit, I thought of what Bonhoeffer would say, and it's not in the Cost of Discipleship, it's from Ethics, is that sometimes people are given an unwinnable scenario when, the example he gives is, so honor your mother and father is obviously one of the 10 Commandments, and thou shalt not lie is another. So what does a child do if they're asked by a teacher, like, is your father an alcoholic, right? So, so sometimes there's points when the commandments are in tension with each other. And unfortunately, because we're all cursed by sin, sometimes maybe, and I can't think of any specific times in my life necessarily, but there definitely are times when people are faced with a decision, and the right choice might be to commit a violent act, or it might be to, in some way, break one of the 10 Commandments.
I definitely feel where you're coming from. You feel trapped in between two bad options, and you're really trying to choose the less bad option.
Well, I definitely think it's a real scenario. I do think more often than not, people probably use that kind of thinking as a way to justify poor behavior, quite frankly. But I do think that there have been, it's not that uncommon in terms of world history that people are faced a situation where, do I honor my tribe, or do I honor what I believe in terms of my morals and my faith? Like you talk about Thomas More, for example, and I guess one of the tragic things of that story is that him and, or at least as I've heard it talked about, I know Cale talks about this a bit, him and Henry VIII were actually good friends, and he had mentored him, and I guess Thomas More even saw quite a bit of potential in Henry VIII. Right?
Yeah, definitely. It was he did not want to be in the position he went into, right? And that's part of why I want to learn more about him eventually, is just because it's when do you draw the line? Like I know a lot of it's pretty common, it seems to me at least, in a lot of the circles that I run in, for people to draw bright lines of, if you take your children to public school, you are in fact a Satanist and you hate them. You should kill yourself. It's like, okay.
Wow.
Slow down. Maybe we should gradate this.
Yeah.
Right? There are lines that are very blurry, right? And it seems to me that one of the big problems is people make too many bright lines, and pretend that they're always going to stand on the one side of it. Except once they get to that fuzzy line in their own life, they can see it for themselves, and it's very uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. I think it's very easy to be like, oh yeah, I would be the martyr, or I would be the person who would stand up for the faith. But at the same time, I think of some people in my family who were kind of who are kind of prone to some extreme behavior. And I mean, you don't always necessarily want the person who's the fly in the ointment, right? Sometimes that just because someone excels in one scenario doesn't mean that they're necessarily well, they're necessarily all a great person. They're just a person who was right for that moment and who rose to that occasion, which yeah, I think of that when I think of like the idea of political dissidency. And yeah.
No, I think you're really right on the money there, is that some people have very extreme personalities, and sometimes that really does shine in a certain situation. But oftentimes it just doesn't, and they're just crazy. Like, sorry to say it, they really are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you talk about the saints and the prophets, right? I mean, John the Baptist, I mean, by all accounts, was
Clearly mad.
Yeah. I mean, he was someone who, I mean, John baptized with fire, right? That's a phrase in the gospel. So, and I mean, I don't know if he was necessarily someone that most people would want to have a meal and sit down with. I mean, maybe it was, I don't know, but there's definitely enough evidence in the scripture to point to the idea that maybe he wasn't.
I mean, just to go back on the other point, though, like if you want to flip the script, isn't Pilate the one who's doing the pragmatic, rational choices that he's making at every turn? Yes, he does try to do the right thing. It seems sometimes like this man has done nothing wrong. I will release him. Oh, wait, that's not what you want? This is a problem, right? I know when I first read the gospel, I was very sympathetic to Pilate, it seemed, because he seemed to be just doing what a Roman governor does, right? But it's pretty clear in the story that he's at fault. And maybe he could have used some of that more extreme personality in that moment to do what was necessary. I often think about the legend of his wife, that she had a dream and a vision where she heard, us crying out the creed every single mass, crucified under Pontius Pilate over and over and over again. Because it's just such a, I don't want to say blunder, but a moral tragedy that was foreordained, but still in that moment, of course, his choices were free. And he definitely chose the world and its pragmatic choices.
Any other thoughts that you had that we haven't got to seek with the reading?
Yeah. So I think one thing I was actually a little surprised. I know because in the corner, PBK talks about authenticity culture and sincerity culture. But I think when I was I don't know, since I first read Eric Metaxas' biography about Bonhoeffer, the person I was then and today, and how I view these things, the lenses have changed, lenses have added. And so it just, I don't know, it feels a lot different. I can kind of see how very, I don't know, I hate throwing the word Protestant around, but it's so very Protestant, where like I was reading this, I have a quote here from page 8 where it says, it was basically Bonhoeffer apparently was inspired in 1930 by a black church in Alabama. It was an Abyssinian Baptist church. And it says, the congregation was on fire with faith, shouting and rejoicing in the worship and during the sermon too. And their many activities during the week reflected what they did on Sunday. Dietrich saw that they were not merely religious, but that they were real Christians, disciples of the Christ they worshipped. So they were not playing church, but rather were the church, the people of God living out their faith with the joy Bonhoeffer had never seen, neither in the churches in Germany nor in the white Protestant churches in New York. That's a very loaded statement, right? Obviously, I can understand, especially back in Germany, no offense to the Germans, but not known for their spunk and vigor, right? And of course, the Black church, something to be more analogous to my experience growing up. So, and I kind of grew up in the idea that if you're not like shouting and all these different things, being loud, being kind of in the spirit, that you're not having a true experience, that you're kind of seeing something different. And I will say, and not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, obviously, in my opinion, but when I went to a concert with my roommate a year or two ago, I was having a great time, but I wasn't singing or anything. I was just kind of sitting there and I was just like lost in thought, like just I don't know, zoned out. I wasn't doing like the whole with like the numbers come up and everything. I was just in there, right? And then he was sitting there, like, "Are you okay? Are you something wrong?" I'm like, "No, this is like who I am when I'm at like my peak. I'm not always just like screaming out lyrics or whatever, right? I'm just in there." So, so experiences like that made me realize that there isn't just one necessarily mode for true expression of worship and stuff like that. And I think, but what the way it's portrayed, at least in this passage, it's very much like if you're not experiencing God or Christ in that kind of mode, that you're not being authentic, your true authentic self. And it's very kind of interesting, because I know that's a huge contrast to German Lutheranism, which I'm sure is a lot more close maybe to I don't want to step on toes here, but probably something similar to like a Catholic mass, right? So, whereas more of the high church, more singing, different things like that. Like I was watching a video with Andrew Gold. He's an architect, he's Orthodox, and he was talking, even though it was originally about architecture, he was talking a lot about the singing in the choirs and stuff. And a lot of choirs just aren't that good around here. And, and he was saying that they don't have that kind of right and proper, I guess, balance. And because they might try and do a Byzantine style service, and they just don't do it very well. And I don't know, I just thought about that, and I was just thinking it's just interesting. So what is truly authentic, and does that actually matter? So
well, I guess I would actually be very interested to know more about the Abyssinian Baptist Church, which he attended, because I feel like there weren't necessarily a lot of details about it. Well, certainly in the forward by Metaxas, but also not really in the larger biography that he wrote. But obviously those were people that Bonhoeffer found as having a faith that was alive in some way that he maybe hadn't experienced before. And I mean, I do seem to remember, not so much in the reading today, but in Metaxas' book, that there was a decent amount of quotes from his writing at the time about it. So it seems to me that was somewhat close to his perception. But yeah, at the same time, I guess if you're used to like the big box kind of Christianity or Pentecostalism, there's a way in which maybe you might in some ways appreciate. I say this as someone who came from a Pentecostal background, you might appreciate the more contemplative kind of services too. But yeah. So.
And me, I get uncomfortable when people put their hands up in mass.
How often does that happen in the masses you go to?
More often than you might think.
Okay.
I go. Sometimes I go to like a tradismatic mass.
Okay.
So
yeah.
So, like they'll play a Hillsong and stuff, but then they do
Really?
the Sanctus, they do the Agnus Dei.
Okay.
So that part would be all in Latin, but they'll have, I don't know, whatever Hillsong song that I've never heard before that.
Interesting.
And people are hands up, I'm like, I don't know. And then I get mad about the bongos.
Oh, there it is. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's a good contrast. It's a good contrast we have here.
Yeah. No, I mean, I sometimes have a hard time with that kind of stuff myself. But I mean, I don't know. I guess in some ways, though, I mean, part of going to church is surrendering a certain amount of control of what you think the ideal is. I mean, and yeah, I mean, they might be singing the wrong songs, or I don't know, quoting the wrong scriptures, or
Let us build the church of God is
awful.
awful. I never want to hear it again.
What? It's a song, or
It's a hymn, and I hate it. Any Catholic who ever watches this and can hear it in their mind right now. Let us build the
oh
city of
yes,
God.
I have
Oh
heard
my!
that before.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, so but yeah, I guess I'll circle back and maybe unless there's other thoughts here, maybe we could keep going for a little bit, but yeah. Yeah, I guess the other thing that I had in mind is that part of the reason I think that Bonhoeffer's writing doesn't have a clear political program behind it is because he really did have faith that he was part of, if you will, I don't know, to use a good cliche, part of a bigger story. And that even though there were things he had to do at the time, that ultimately his life wasn't about resistance. It was about building something for the kingdom. And I mean, even though I find it kind of interesting when I hear people talk about him as being a resistance figure. I mean, there's truth there, but at the same time, a lot of what he did was seminary foundation and training, and it was his writing. A lot of it was very contemplative too, and I mean, he really did. I think believe that part of where Germany had failed was that it didn't hear the call of Christ, so to speak. And I know I've heard some people sort of like mock that idea in reference to Bonhoeffer, but I don't know how you can escape it if you read The Cost of Discipleship and you read his other writings, that he really believed that Nazism was a heresy and that Germany had fallen prey to it because it didn't take the gospel serious enough. And yeah, I think of that. And I think of how true that is for all of us. I mean, yeah, one of the most haunting things that Ratzinger ever wrote was one letter late in his life. It may have been the last public thing he wrote, where he asked for forgiveness. And what he said was, God is dying. And if you take from that, he basically was saying, we allowed this horrendous thing to happen in the church. It was in reference to the sex abuse scandal because we didn't believe the gospel and we didn't believe God. And I think that Bonhoeffer would definitely say something very similar about what had happened to Germany in the 1930s and into the 1940s.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my last comment, because I gotta get going too, is what you say brings you back to something Bishop Barron always says. The biggest takeaway from Christianity is your life is not about you. And that seems to be the case.
Yeah, so, yeah, I mean, my life is hidden in Christ, right? Yeah. Any final comments, Zeke?
Probably not, I guess. I think
Okay.
y'all kind of summed it up pretty well, so.
All right, I'm just going to close with a reading here real quickly. In his day, Bonhoeffer was thought a radical, but isn't that the point of his popularity ever since? He actually believed what the Bible said and proved that by living his faith all the way and indeed until death, to use the traditional parlance. He bade us all to follow him in this, just as Jesus bade us all pick up our crosses and follow him. In both of these exhortations, there is an indispensable prophetic element. For how is it that Jesus spoke of his cross so long before there was any talk of crucifying him? Long before the grim specter of the horrific Roman death. Just so when Bonhoeffer, in this book, wrote of Christ bidding us to come and die, We can hardly know how now help hearing it in the context of Bonhoeffer's own future death. But this is where the radical quality of Bonhoeffer and Jesus becomes attainable to all of us. We see that they did not merely believe or merely hope that there was heaven on the other side of their suffering and death. They knew there was life beyond this pale and preliminary life. They had no doubt of that reality beyond what looks like human death. And they knew that what looks to us like death is in fact a portal to the very antithesis of death. Thanks for joining tonight.
Amen.